Strategy and Policy Committee meeting for the 21st of August. We've got a fairly full agenda, and Tracy optimistically believes that we'll be done by about 12:40, so we'll see where we land. Depends on toilet breaks and that sort of thing. So we will kick off this morning with a Karakia. Thank you, Tracy.
Kia ora, thank you, Chair Warren. Whakatakataho ki te uru, whakatakataho ki te tonga. Kia mā kina ki uta, kia mā taratara ki tai. I hiaki ana te atakura, he teo, he huka, he hauhu, ti hei mauri ora.
Thank you, Tracy. Health and safety, I think we can take that as read, and Blair, I'll trust that you will deal with Brad if the blue light goes off and lead him out of the building safely. Excellent, thank you. Apologies. I have apologies for lateness for Councillor Story and Councillor Graf and Councillor Mahuta. Apologies for absence. We have Noel online, and in the chambers we have Councillor Kneebone, Councillor Dunbar-Smith, Councillor Strange, Councillor Downard, Councillor Cookson, Councillor Hughes, Councillor Clarkson, and myself. And sorry, Katarina, Councillor Hodge. Yeah. If I can have a mover and a seconder, thank you. Oh, Jen, sorry. Yep, Jen's online, in and out. And yeah, I mentioned Noel online. Thank you, Councillor Downard. Councillor Cookson, all those in favour? Opposed? So carried. Confirmation of the agenda before us today. Sure you've all read it. I'm happy to move it. And a seconder. Thank you, Councillor Hodge. All those in favour? Opposed? So carried. Just noting that we do have that addendum with us as well, and I'm sure you've all had that copy either by email or in paper. Disclosures of interest. Are there any disclosures of interest for anyone on any of the agenda items today? Take that as a no. Nobody online? No. Thank you. We have some minutes to confirm from the Strategy and Policy meeting on the 21st of January. If I can have a mover and a seconder if everyone is happy how they're correct. Accurate record. Thank you, Councillor Hughes. Seconded, Councillor Clarkson. All those in favour? I say January. Sorry, I stand corrected, June. All those in favour? Opposed? So carried. That brings us to our first item up today, which is an economic update. As you will remember, in the last meeting, we had a quick online update from Brad Olsen from Infometrics, and Brad has kindly joined us today alongside Blair Keenan. So I'll hand over to Tracy to introduce.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, councillors, this last time when we had it presented, it was first, sorry, if I step back, councillors intimated to the Chief Executive that they would like more regular, up-to-date current information and reporting on economic insights for the region. So we were able to secure Brad and Blair online for our last session. This is a little less hurried and a bit more considered. What we haven't done is responded to every single matter that councillors raised at the last Strategy and Policy Committee, because we thought it would be good just to paint the picture of where we're at. But it is definitely a conversation for the next triennium where we would like to tease out more for those councillors who return, Katarina and her next bunch of folk. Actually, what are the insights that you're after? Because we can give you all the data you possibly want. It's what is the actual richness. So perhaps once you've heard and had the conversations with Blair and Brad today, if there's anything that you want to particularly highlight that we can put in that mix for consideration for next term, that would be great. So, over to the two gentlemen, Blair.
Kia ora koutou. I'll assume I can take the report in the agenda as read. Happy to take any questions on that. I guess the one sort of theme that I wanted to highlight through that is that, you know, we hear a lot about the Waikators being a fast-growing region, and it is in some ways. There's certainly been a lot of population growth in recent years, but from what we've seen, the region has sometimes struggled to sort of absorb that population and put it to work, if you like. So that theme runs through that paper. And as I say, I'm happy to take any questions on it. Otherwise, I don't want to take up too much of Brad's oxygen because he's got a plane to catch later on, whereas you can find me anytime.
Thank you, Blair. Are there any outstanding questions just on that report, or we'll just jump straight into Brad's here?
Well, if I can, I'd like to ask a question. I was told 10 days ago that one of the reasons for our population growth in Hamilton in particular was a policy decision by the previous government to move 20,000 people out of South Auckland and rehouse them in motels in Hamilton, Te and Rotorua and Tauranga. Apparently Hamilton got half of those. So can you confirm that as fact?
I can't confirm that if that was a policy decision or not, but there certainly was a lot of people moving into emergency housing over that period. So it could well be some of the explanation for it. I think if you look at where the growth and population has been, the Waikato district and Hamilton City are far and away out in front, which could support that.
Thanks, Blair.
Yeah, Ben.
Yeah, I just had a question about outflows to Australia. Have we got any indication about migration, people leaving the Waikato region?
Not from Waikato specifically, so we've got a better national picture of that, and it's certainly a concern. Because typically that's the group that potentially have more options, and you certainly want to retain that human capital, for want of a better word.
Right. Okay. We'll wait for Brad.
Thanks. So we'll leave that there and hand over to Brad for his presentation.
Kia ora, good morning, everyone. Fantastic to be with you, especially in person, and to be experiencing a bit of the warmth and hospitality of the Waikato region, certainly compared to Wellington at the moment. Just briefly on a few responses to those before I get into the presentation. I think it'd be hard to substantiate exactly what the population growth was from in terms of emergency housing or not. What I would say is we've recently done a bit of analysis at Infometrics looking at homelessness trends and by extension some of the other numbers around people living in temporary and emergency housing. The Waikato in general has a slightly lower proportion of people in that situation than other regions like Auckland. So it's not as easy to see in the numbers, for example, in 2023 that has necessarily come through. And if it has, it's probably, or it might well have more been that they moved in to the region at the time in emergency housing, but they've subsequently gone into other areas. So they're not still in that position, if that makes sense. More generally, there has been a shift downwards from Auckland and into the Waikato. But that's more of everyone is leaving, well, not everyone is leaving Auckland, more people than otherwise are leaving Auckland, and that Waikato is a great place for them to immediately move to. On the Australia point, we don't have any specifics on the subnational flow or outflow. We know the national figures, and that's unfortunately about it at the moment. We're not, though, noticing anything particularly different in the Waikato in terms of population trends in recent times compared to the rest of the country. So I don't think there's anything that would suggest that Waikato is doing any differently from the national average in terms of some of those trends. But if I might, I will share a screen and share my homework that I have prepared earlier, as always. Fantastic, it's working. First and foremost, you of course saw the Reserve Bank yesterday come out with its expectations around the economy, which are that things are looking a little bit tougher in the near term, and I guess that's where we've been seeing the economy too, and that the recovery, it is coming through, but it's taking longer to gather a bit of pace. Now, after the last conversation that I had with the committee, having discussions with staff and officials, we decided sort of the best way to try and cover off the smorgasbord of things we could talk about in the economy was to provide a bit of an update on some of the trends we're seeing in sort of more recent times. And so as part of that, Council now has access to our quarterly insights. We've just published those for the June quarter today. For the Waikato, on an annual average basis, activity remains lower over the 12 months on average to June compared to a year ago. For the quarter, for June quarter itself, things are actually a little bit better in the Waikato than where they were at the same time for the June quarter last year. And all that's to say that the recovery is coming through, but it is sort of a slow shift that it takes to get out. What we also wanted to do, though, was provide a few insights on some of the more long-term structural changes that have come through. It'd be great if any organisation, central or local government, could have that much influence on a local economy in the next 3 months, but generally speaking, policy lags take a while to come through. So wanting to give you a flavour of your operating environment, but also some of those longer-term trends, which I'll go through today. And with the Chair's permission, I'll take questions at the end, only because that will help sort of get through the entire flow of things. So the Reserve Bank decision, of course, saw an expectation that the Reserve Bank not only cut yesterday, but thinks they'll have to cut a little bit more in the next wee while. You can see the official cash rate track there edging down in August compared to where they forecast things in May. Long story short, there's now an expectation that things get down to around 2.5% at some point over the next sort of 6 months or so. At Infometrics, we've now penciled in further cuts in October and November. The Reserve Bank has been at pains to say that, look, they think that's where the economy is going, but they are realistic that there are risks on either side. There's the risk that worse economic conditions persist and that all of a sudden you don't have quite as much growth as expected and that they'd need to stimulate a bit more. Equally, they're looking at things and going, well, they also expect that inflation might head towards or above 3%, the top of their target band. And if that risk around inflation started to bleed over into other business decisions, then again, they might not be able to stimulate the economy quite as much. So there's a lot of uncertainty out there, but the direction of travel in our mind seems a little bit firmer on the economy not going or getting going as quick, needs a little bit more support. Of course, just because the official cash rate changed yesterday and because they expect a few more cuts doesn't mean that anyone's lives are completely different this morning. Most people are still on the fixed mortgage rate that they had yesterday and will be for a while. And so again, the lags in monetary policy generally 12 to 18 months for the full effect. And so what the Reserve Bank is having to do is assess what's happening right here, right now, what they think will be happening in 12 months' time, and then make a call of making a change that might influence that 12-month piece and then seeing where things land out. So a lot of uncertainty sitting there at the moment. Certainly compared to where we've been recently, we know that there's still a lot of concern around global trade policy and the tariffs that we're seeing globally. You can see the updated chart here showing the highest levels of US tariffs since the Great Depression. Interestingly, though, and probably, I guess, a bit of a catch-22 for New Zealand, we have now got a higher tariff rate at 15% compared to where we started at 10%. It's also not as good of a tariff rate or a higher tariff rate relative to some of our international partners. Australia, for example, getting a lower 10% tariff. Now, on the sort of direct front, that higher tariff rate isn't quite as good for New Zealand. Particularly, wine is probably the most exposed single sector. Indirectly, though, the tariff rates we're seeing at the moment might actually be not a bad thing for New Zealand relative to where we were in April. I say that because, as the chart shows, the effective tariff rate at 18% now is down from what was announced at the start of April, which was about 22%. So directly between New Zealand and the US, things are going to be a bit tougher. But trade with other trading partners and the US are likely to be not hit as bad, which means that those other countries that we also export to shouldn't have as bad of an economic hit and should hopefully be able to trade a bit more with us than where we were in April. Long story short, January good, April bad, July bad but not quite as bad as April, but worse than Jan, if that makes sense, is sort of how we've seen that thing evolve. Let's talk the primary sector because, of course, that is a key part of the Waikato economy and is very much leading parts of that economic recovery so far. We know that commodity prices are still in a pretty healthy position, although in recent times they've moderated a touch. You can see on this chart the likes of dairy and horticulture prices just trying to sort of establish a bit more of a new normal as we've started into the new season in terms of selling across the world. The likes of meat also still in a good position, but you've got higher prices for meat, lower volumes of kills coming through as well. So in terms of actual money into the economy, bit of flux coming through there. You will, however, note that the likes of forestry remains pretty poor, to be blunt, across the board. Interestingly, volumes of forestry products being exported are actually still solid and up on a year ago, which is a little bit hard to understand given that prices are pretty rubbish. I think part of that is that people have already made decisions and sort of just need to keep cash flow going, even though returns aren't quite as good. But these numbers all are encouraging in terms of what they're providing into the sector. As last time, an index is a good way to sort of show some overall trends, but nice to get some specifics. For the Waikato region, we currently expect back-to-back payouts of $4.8 billion from the dairy sector, which of course is quite a lot of money coming through. Not all of that is being spent immediately. We know, looking at some areas, that people are quite smartly paying down debt to start with, doing a bit of deferred maintenance and other deferred works, and then only slowly but surely after that we'll start to spend and invest a bit more. There's also a bit of a tendency in some of the numbers for people to, I guess, be quite focused on cost of living pressures, even from a business perspective. And so where people are making spending or investment decisions, they're wanting to try and get a cheaper operating sort of longer term costs coming through. Back in June, we saw a little bit of an increase in a few light commercial vehicle registrations. And what that was driven by was an increase in the new BYD Shark 6 utes that were coming through, plug-in hybrids, cheaper cost up front, much cheaper operating cost over time, much less variable as a business because you're paying electricity and what have you, compared to petrol, which is actually more volatile, even though the energy market's still a bit questionable. But just, I thought it was an interesting trend that, yep, we were seeing a bit more investment, but people were being more cautious about their costs as well. We're seeing a bit of I guess, a shift around in the last couple of months in terms of how the trends for the economy in different parts have gone. As you can see on this chart with manufacturing, we had a bit of a burst of manufacturing at the start of this year, bit of expansion relative to where things were the last two, where manufacturing was generally in contraction. Come through to the second quarter of the year, April through June, and things turned back into contractionary territory, weren't feeling quite as good. And then the latest data we've got for July showed a bit more of a spike up. And so again, trend-wise, it feels like start of the year, all right, second quarter of the year, bit miserable, poor weather, everything else going on. Partials for the July month so far show a bit more activity. And so we're hoping that, again, the economic recovery continuing, but just moving a bit more in fits and starts. And part of that is because we're only really slowly but surely seeing a bit of a trend come through with the likes of debt servicing costs coming lower. You can see on the chart the likes of agriculture already showing a bit more of a shift down. The likes of housing, though, in terms of the amount of money that people are spending on their mortgages, that's only really turning around quite slowly. Yes, we've now been cutting interest rates for a year, but again, that time delay on how quickly people refix onto those mortgage rates means that you just haven't really had that oomph emerge. Even when you do, it's not like people who might refix their mortgage today go out tomorrow and have a huge amount more money to spend immediately. One, it takes them a little bit of time to build that up. Two, it takes them a bit of confidence to part with that cash. And we are seeing quite a few signs where people are being a lot more conservative. They're sort of acting, if you will, like they're still on the higher mortgage rate, keeping their repayments at a higher level, primarily because the labour market's still not great. If you're sitting out there and going, well, yep, I've got some more money, but I'm worried about my job prospects, then I'll sort of act a little bit more unemployed and keep my money to myself in case the worst happens. We do expect that, again, though, as more spending becomes available, even bits of it coming out into the economy will stimulate more business sales. That should stimulate a bit more hiring. Then people have a bit more confidence about the labour market, and so on and so forth. Unfortunately, we are quite tied to confidence at the moment. One interesting figure we did have recently was that in the TVNZ One News Varian poll that they do, mostly known for, of course, the political numbers, but we've tracked since the 70s the economic outlook in that survey, and we've currently got the highest proportion of New Zealand households in a decade that are expecting economic conditions in 12 months' time to be the same as today. So it's not like people think that the economy is necessarily going to get worse, but people so far don't necessarily think it's going to get better. And that's where we think that confidence challenge is coming from. People are going, well, if it's going to be the same as right now, I'm just going to sort of hold my horses on spending and investment. Part of that as well, of course, is because the cost of living challenges remain. Overall, headline inflation in a much better position, but a number of more frequent in-your-face costs are continuing to hit. Food price inflation continuing to increase in recent times, and energy costs also rising now at double-digit paces for the first time in over a decade. The challenge there is that a lot of that, at least on the Food front is partly environmental, and more globally environmental than anything else. You're seeing higher dairy and meat costs across the world because there's quite high levels of demand for those products, but not quite as much being produced in a number of areas. New Zealand's still doing quite a bit, but other countries aren't. And then the likes of other items, olive oil, chocolate, coffee, all of the raw materials for those are not being produced quite as much because there's either been too much sun, too much rain, or something else in between, depending on the production country. So all of that does sort of highlight that there are a few more global pressures that are starting to hit us here at home. So then, to the local trends that we're seeing, probably the most vital and going to the point around that sort of concern around confidence is that job numbers are still, of course, lower. You saw in Blair's report a few comments around the likes of the unemployment rate, but also the high number of people that we count as not in the labour force. They're not unemployed because they're not looking for jobs, they're doing other things. Sometimes they've gone back into study, sometimes they're just not looking at all because they can't find a role and it's not worth them continuing to do it. Sometimes they're going back, looking after family at home or a variety of other things. You can see by the numbers, the tax data numbers, that employment in the Waikato region down about 0.7% in the latest quarter. So that's about 1,400 roles down on where things were a year ago. Tough, but to be fair, when we've looked across the country, one of the better performing North Island economies at least. Generally at the moment, the Waikato and Bay of Plenty seeing less of a hit than the lower North Island and the likes of Auckland and similar. And I think that's because you're seeing a bit more of that primary sector activity showing through. The bigger contraction at the moment here locally, and to be fair, across the country, is in the construction sector. As you can see on this chart, I knew I had one coming up. The gains locally are not quite enough to offset the declines, but the gains coming in the likes of health and education still, but you're seeing as well that boost in the primary sector. Primary sector doesn't normally add that many jobs, so this is sort of notable for a bit of a lift. But other end of the spectrum, you can see a real big contraction in that construction number, fewer jobs and roles as well in manufacturing, retail, trade, professional services. There is a bit of a private sector hit still across the board. It's sort of no one factor, apart from construction basically going up quite a lot the last couple of years and then coming down. The real worry going forward is this chart showing the age profile of employment trends. You can see there nearly 1,400 people directly aged 15 to 24 who are not in employment anymore, another nearly 700 odd in the next 10-year age group. And then basically gains or not much of a loss, 6 people in the 45 to 54 group. Broadly speaking, much better employment opportunities coming through in the other ends. And that's, again, quite usual for an economic downturn. Generally, it's the first in who are the last out, have the least skills, have the least experience, but is, I think, a real challenge around talent attraction and retention. And to the councillor's question before, that's the group that we suspect is definitely heading out a lot more than it's coming in now in terms of losses to Australia or anywhere else across the world too. So we are worried about that sort of youth unemployment piece. One of the challenges as well that we find is that changes recently by the government to the likes of the Mayor's Task Force for Jobs program has now meant that the focus has got to be on people who are already on job seeker support or other benefits, rather than trying to keep people from ever getting onto the benefit numbers. So that is causing quite a lot of concern across a number of mayors and chairs that we've spoken to across the country, who are worried now that people have to be sort of formally in the system before they get help, rather than trying to stop young people getting into that more compromised position. All of that has led to a bit of a contraction in spending as well. To be fair, roughly about the same drop in spending as the drop in employment, which is more than can be said for a number of other regions across the country. We have seen larger drops in spending and or employment too. Broadly speaking, yes, that spending's down 0.8% in the Waikato compared to a year ago, but it's broadly trending sideways at the moment. And I think that's again reflective of the fact that for households, they're not confident enough to spend quite as much. They're worried about that sort of employment hit. And so because of that, having to pay more for the essentials as well means that there's less discretionary spending. They're not going out and doing quite as much domestic travel. They're not going out to do quite as much spending on DIY or hardware, apparel, anything like that. People are quite focused on, I need the essentials, I need to pay the power bill, the food bill, the fuel bill, rent or the mortgage, and apart from that, I'm going to try and limit everything else. So that will take time to turn around. As I said, one of the key challenges that have emerged in recent times, and the fact that you've lost 1,000 people in the construction workforce, is what's happening to consents. Residential consents in the Waikato region down about 8% over the last year compared to where they were a year ago. But interestingly, you'll see the last 6 months or so broadly tracking sideways, so sort of hitting a bit of a bottom and then starting to track sideways. It's just that, again, the sector's now effectively come off what was a very large amount of work and an unusually large amount of work, and now coming into an unusually low amount of work. In fact, the lowest there since about 2015 or so. And so, again, those challenges that we're seeing, a lot more directed by the private sector rather than, regulation or anything else. Government is enabling and forcing a lot more provision of land and similar to be opened up, and for particularly local authorities to provide the right infrastructure and zoning. The challenge, though, is that at the moment it's not a great idea to develop a house when you're going to make less money than you thought and you're going to pay more money to create it. That doesn't normally create the right conditions for as much additional housing. On the investment side, again, bit of a pullback, but not to quite the same fall that you saw in the residential market. The likes of non-residential, so commercial, industrial, sort of vertical, we're talking buildings here, up a touch on where it was a couple of months back on a year-end basis, but down again from that peak. I think looking at this, things could have been a heck of a lot worse. You could have seen a lot more businesses recently go, look, I haven't got the gumption to go forward with my investments, so I'd pull back. You've had a little bit of that, and naturally so, because interest rates recently have been higher, but you haven't sort of seen in the last couple of months a concerted pullback across the board. And I think, again, that shows a level of sort of resilience that's showing through, particularly that support from the primary sector. Changing track then. Noting all of the various trends that I've just shown you in the short term, also thought it was worthwhile going through and seeing some of the trends that we're seeing when we look through into the details of the Waikato region economy. Now, as was outlined earlier, there's a lot of data in there, and so we could be here for days, if not months, probably looking at all the different figures. So this isn't a comprehensive thing of everything you need to know about the Waikato. You're smart people, most of you are going to know parts of it. It was more wanting to dig a little bit down into the details of what trends are we seeing emerge that might be worth actually surfacing that don't come up quite as much. A few pieces to that. The first one is around the likes of population growth and actually how that's been coming through into the region in recent times. You can see a few various trends emerging there. Let's deal with the green one to start with, the international migration. Waikato's international migration generally following the national average pretty well in terms of a big spike at the start of the pandemic when people who were going to leave didn't leave because they couldn't, because we'd locked the borders down. Then a very low level of, in fact, more people leaving than coming in during the middle of the pandemic when people couldn't come in. Open the borders, things spiked back up, and then in recent times have started to fall back away a little bit more. What's interesting is that you can sort of see that over time, that one is the much more volatile trend in terms of migration. And so increasingly relying on international migration as a region would require you to be a lot more beholden to whatever the whims of government of the day are in terms of migration trends and similar. The others, though, that are providing a bit more stability, the likes of internal migration. And so you can see there sort of around 2,000 people a year more moving into the Waikato than moving out to other parts of the country. And again, that's a lot around, I think, lifestyle, but also sort of house prices, job opportunities, and where there's sort of actual development land that's coming through. And so you do see that in a lot of areas. You see that through parts of Hamilton, but you also see it across the likes of the Waikato district, through into Waipa, and continuing to sort of move south and east to a degree as the developments sort of come through. The last bit, the natural increase, the orange line, the number of births happening here locally minus the number of deaths. We have seen in recent times that, again, that trend, if you stripped out the other two spiky charts, that one does trend down over time. You do, of course, have an older population emerging, but also not people who are younger, not having quite as many children as before. The point I guess I'd make, particularly in terms of thinking about economic development and opportunities, is it's really that blue line that you can influence most. You can't, as a council or with any of your other levers, indirectly start to influence the number of older people or the number of younger people having children. Good luck to you. Other people have tried, I'm sure. I mean, even government spending doesn't seem to do a lot for changing those trends. Again, as a regional area, you don't have quite as much influence on the international piece, but you do have a bit more influence on how you ensure that your area is the sort of place to be when people want to base themselves for business and for living. And so again, I think sort of more potential there around the broader settings that are coming through, and increasingly important collaboration with local authorities as well in terms of ensuring you've got that strong development pathway. We know that people don't just move to an area and hope like goodness they can find a job. Most of the time there's a bit of a reason for that shift. And so if you've got good lifestyle offerings, and the Waikato's got some great lifestyle offerings across the board, plus that ability to develop so that businesses can see themselves here, that's, I think, where you'll continue to get more opportunity. Talking about the ageing population, there's I think, worthwhile to profile that it's not that everything is completely aging. Actually, here in the Waikato, you've got a little bit of a inverse U, if you will, where you've got a higher proportion than the national average, yes, of older people proportionately, but also a higher proportion of younger people coming through. Now, the younger piece is a little bit skewed, not fully, but a little bit skewed by the fact that you've got a much younger population in Hamilton, slightly coming through the university, but otherwise as well. In fact, Hamilton City is has the youngest median age of any local authority in the country. So that really does sort of provide you with a little bit more of that potential mix of up-and-comers who you can hopefully have stick around. Does create some challenges, though, in the middle years where you're clearly not able to retain that proportion to quite the same degree as other parts of the country, and so there are often a few more shifts. So you might well have a few more younger people moving into the region at various points for university and sort of early stage career. You've then got them that move away to a greater degree sort of mid-career, and then you've got a bit more who then move in later life. And for example, you've also got, alongside Hamilton being the youngest, you've got Thames Coromandel being the oldest median age in the country. So real sort of edges there in terms of activity. That also means that you've got quite a challenge in terms of what types of services you provide and how you cater to people. A lot of other parts of the country, you can generally say to them, look, you need to start moving your entire provision a little bit up the age range. So, you know, for local councils, sometimes you don't need quite as many new kids playgrounds, but you might need more sort of adult or older age care provision and similar. Here, you sort of need a bit of both. And I think that's good because it does provide you diversity, but it does also mean you've got to split your focus a little bit more than otherwise. The other, and I thought quite interesting point, we're not talking huge margins here, but the Waikato is actually increasing as a proportion of the national population now. The latest data we've got for 2024 shows that you're just around about that 10% mark now of the national population, having gotten to around about 9.4% in that sort of mid-2000s piece, and then generally trending up from there. So you are getting that sort of, you're getting population growth, but you're getting an even greater proportion over time. Some of the analysis that we've done at Infometrics suggests that over a longer period as well, the Hamilton urban area will become the third largest urban area after Auckland and Christchurch. You'll overtake Wellington. Wellington is not happy about this, to be clear, but I think sort of shows again that level of concentration that you're starting to see, and then the sort of halo effect that comes from having that core urban centre, but then a very good rural provision out in some of the other districts as well that sort of all add. It means that you can, again, have a little bit of the best of both worlds. You're not too beholden all to the primary sector, but you've got enough that when it goes well, you can get good stuff, but it also counterbalances with other industries too. Which is one of the final points I wanted to make, which is that you actually have seen a greater sort of diversification in your economy over time. You can see that the proportion of GDP for the Waikato that's gone into the primary sector, agriculture, forestry and fishing, has fallen by nearly 5% over the last 20 years. Nationally, it's only fallen by about 2% or so. So again, you've got a slightly bigger shift away from primary directly into other areas. Looking into the data, it's not that the primary sector has become smaller, it's just that other stuff has grown a fair bit more. You can see as well, you've got less reliance over time in the likes of manufacturing and education to a degree. That's again more because you've seen some increases, particularly in the South Island around Christchurch, doing more in that education space. Looking at the top, though, is probably the area which tells you whether or not you've got sort of longer term both growth and also productive growth. The biggest increase, but broadly in line with the national average, is that professional, scientific and technical services. Generally, that's your sort of your brains trust sort of people. They are often being paid at a high level. That's where productivity gains often come through. And so you're doing well in terms of having that growth, but you haven't necessarily seen an outsized increase. You have a bit more in the likes of health and a little bit in public administration. Wouldn't write home too much about public admin. You don't want to become Wellington. But that health provision as well, I think, shows that you're becoming a little bit more of a hub into your own right. You always have been, to be clear, but just a little bit more with, again, that concentration of population growth and similar showing forward. One area that sort of stands out a little bit more, the two other areas that stand out a bit more to me in that chart are the likes of info and telecommunications, so generally your ICT, and also financial services, where you've seen a larger increase in those two industries at a national level, not quite as much of a gain at a local level in those. And so again, in terms of areas that are probably more ripe for development and probably lower hanging fruit or more potential, that's probably the two that I mean, literally stand out on the graph a little bit more. A few more trends. The first one is looking around knowledge intensive work. So again, that's generally your higher skill levels. They're doing a certain level of work that's normally less resource intensive. So they're not using up as much physical resource. They're using up brain power and doing more in the services part of the economy. You can see on this chart, the likes of the Waikato region does sit below the national average when it comes to knowledge intensive, but the gap hasn't really moved in either direction too much. The likes of Hamilton, urban centres always have a higher proportion anyway, but just I guess highlighting that yes, while there have been changes and growth and similar over time, for some of those more structural trends, there hasn't been quite as much shift for anyone, to be fair, but it's not like the Waikato has been able to shift that dial as much either. So again, skills development and thinking about how to work in those spaces, like I said before, ICT, financial services and similar, are areas that would probably give you a bit more gain. Interesting as well is the shift in the self-employment rate, and that generally we're seeing the self-employment rate trend down over time. That's generally because I think you're seeing sort of bunching and what economists call your agglomeration benefits coming together. Often, yes, means that you're not your own boss to the same degree anymore, but also means that you've got sort of greater access to capital the larger you become when you sort of get a bit more scale and similar. Interesting though, quite clearly the wild sort of shift for Waipā district, and the reason I included that was more to sort of show that you can have some big shifts. What happened, of course, around that period was the GFC, but also a concerted sort of shift in population towards Waipā district. And when we've looked into it, the increase in self-employment rate that you saw for Waipā at that time was much more focused around the likes of professional services, IT as well, and a bit of public sector activity too, sort of supporting public agencies. I think that says a few things. One, it's very easy in an economic downturn to get rid of employees and make them contractors, and basically they get to do the same job. But also that, again, that sort of population shift that you've seen over time has supported a little bit more in certain areas, not everywhere, but certain areas in terms of self-employment and people being able to sort of look after their own destiny and be their own boss. So not saying that's necessarily an area that you want to lean into or away from, but is just showing that there's quite a bit of variety depending on where you look. Productivity is probably one of the more challenging charts for the Waikato, although on average locally you are seeing higher levels of productivity than a number of other areas that you're continuing to be pretty close to the national average. You'll see that from about 2016-17 onwards, the Waikato's GDP per worker has fallen behind the national average slightly. Now, considering the national average productivity is still not great by international standards either, the fact that the Waikato has slipped back a bit is, I say concerning, not red alarm concerning, but just enough that that's sort of an area where, again, if you can try and get some of those productive gains, it's not just growth for growth's sake. Population is good, but clearly you haven't necessarily been able to convert the population gains into people doing quite as much or quite as high a value add role with some of those. And notwithstanding that point, you will also note that the likes of Waikato remains quite a bit stronger in terms of productivity levels than other comparator areas like, for example, the Bay of Plenty. And so again, you're seeing some of those gains. Given the likes of Charter, also Hamilton and Waipa, that those numbers have been, you can sort of see the difference in position there. It's generally that you have seen the likes of the urban centres with Hamilton from a lower base, starting to catch up a little bit more, and other areas like Waipa and similar, they've had a lot of development, but haven't been able to sort of convert all of that development into higher value work to the same degree. Final couple, I promise. The other one was just even within the primary sector. I told you before that the Waikato region has seen a fall in the proportion of economic activity coming from the primary sector. But interestingly, within that figure, within the primary sector itself, you're seeing a bit of a shift away from the likes of dairy towards the likes of horticulture. Now, slim pickings. I'm not saying you're sort of, seeing huge conversions from dairy farms to kiwi fruit vines and similar, but just enough of a proportional shift that, again, I think as we're seeing different sort of temperature changes and similar, people are starting to explore more of those opportunities. And certainly from a regional council point of view, considering that sort of land use, considering water provision and similar, will become quite an increasingly important conversation, particularly for enabling some of this growth where there's clearly demand. We know, for example, that kiwi fruit exports at the moment are sitting at their highest levels ever, seen a very considerable jump the last couple of years. So there will be continued demand in those sorts of areas, but water has become a key constraint for a number of horticulture and related sectors across the country. That sort of message and conversation, I think, will continue to come through for the Waikato as well over time. How you deal with that is not my purview, and I'm more than happy to say that that's not an area that I want to get too much into, but just noting that there is a real sort of continued reason why it will come up. The last bit, I'm not expecting you to read this at all, but just more showing that, again, as part of the continued analysis that we're providing through to councillors, but also to staff and officials, is that we are providing a much greater and richer detail on sort of quarterly trends. Genuinely not expecting you to look at either. It was just more that every one of those bars is a new economic indicator that we've now been able to bring through so that there is an update on what's happening in the Waikato region on a more quarterly basis. With that, I'll turn the economic fire hose off as usual, and through the chair, happy to take any and all questions.
Thank you very much, Brad, for a very informative presentation, and hopefully we can get a copy of those slides if we don't have them already. And just for me, it's really where those trends are sitting and where those opportunities that you've indicated for us for the future of the Waikato. So we will go to questions. Bruce.
Oh, look, thanks, Brad. Education sector on one of those graphs, you showed that significant increase, but that's a very big sector,
Yes.
a broad and diverse sector. Can you drill down any way?
We can. I haven't for this analysis, but yes, we can dig into that a bit more. I think you will have seen a few trends, I think, in that space. One, there's some general growth that's come through with the population that'll mean you've got greater increases in general schooling, so your primary and secondary schooling. Part of it as well, though, will be the shifts that you're seeing in university provision over time, and certainly Waikato universities become a bigger player, but also that everyone else is also trying to get into the mix. One area that we haven't, I don't know off the top of my head quite as much, but I will also be interested in looking at later on, is the sort of vocational part of education and training. Of course, that's gone through some pretty tough times in recent times and a lot of rejigging. What we are, I think, seeing at the moment that causes a little bit of concern is that the number of people that are in apprenticeship and being trainees and similar in businesses across the country and also in the Waikato is down from a couple of years ago, which does sort of highlight that you're not only seeing a high level of unemployment and sort of a shift away from traditional education, but sometimes that people aren't even engaging in the vocational stuff as much either.
I'm also interested in the turnover because when I looked at that figure, I was being a close observer of the education sector. That's an increase, but is that it's like a net result of what's been happening in the last 5 or 6 years, which has been a lot of loss.
Yes.
And then a replacement and an increase?
Yeah, so it'll be various ins and outs. I think primarily the increase will have been coming through from the likes of primary and secondary schooling, and so it's the tertiary ins and outs all at the same time that are probably the more volatile part. Generally speaking, the likes of your primary and secondary schooling sort of employment numbers trend very strongly with your population growth. So that's a large part of where it will come through. There's a sort of sub question to that almost of, have you had enough growth to provision for all of that population growth? So, you might have had more primary and secondary school teachers. Has it been enough to sort of meet population growth? Given some of the conversations and strike actions and what have you at the moment, potentially not.
Thank you. That's great. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, Chris.
Yeah. Thanks, Mr. Chair, and thanks for your presentation, Brad. Always interesting, stimulating. I've got several questions, if I can, and I'll read through them, and then you can answer them.
Rattle them
just-
all off, and I'll hit
Just
them.
noting that Brad is limited on time.
Try and keep it
Speak
brief.
quick. Yeah, thanks, Chris.
The first one, the greatest bill ever, which in the States, knowing how important the States is to the world economy and particularly for New Zealand, second biggest trading partner, third biggest. The tariffs, I'm hearing that the tariffs are likely to cover the $3 trillion cost of that great bill. Can you confirm that or not?
I mean, it's a bit of a sort of robbing Peter to pay Paul there. I haven't looked at the specifics of the ins and outs. I do know that, of course, the US Treasury is collecting a lot more from tariffs in recent times, and it's the highest numbers ever. The challenge is that you're starting to see it flow through into the inflation indicators too. So it might well be that you have a bit of tariff coverage for the one great beautiful bill or whatever it's called, but at the same time, the reductions in tax payments are generally accruing to those wealthier Americans and not sort of across the board. So they're more likely to save or invest that money rather than spend it, particularly on New Zealand exports and similar. And that on the tariff front, you're going to hit the entire economy with higher inflationary pressures. So there might be some offset, but it might be sort of a short-lived offset for a longer term drawdown on the entire US economy.
Construction, are you seeing any reduction in costs? There's a reduction in activity. Does that forcing cost reductions or not?
To a degree, it depends on exactly. I mean, part of like timber, for example, yes. Labour costs, no. But you're not seeing people that are getting paid less. You're seeing fewer or smaller pay gains emerging. There are, I think, pockets of where people are pricing much more competitively for work, both across the likes of the residential sector. You are seeing on one figure that we look at the first reduction since I think 2011 of construction costs, very minor, 0.1%, but it did show there was a bit of an easing off. We're also hearing when we talk to councils across the country, that there's a real shift in how many people are bidding for work, much higher number of people putting in bids for tenders, but also more competitive pricing, particularly in transport infrastructure sort of costs, some of that. The likes of water infrastructure cost inflation, though, still running quite hot because there's such demand. So I guess the underlying point there is that, yes, there's a bit of a reduction, but it depends on if it's in areas that don't have as much demand or work at the moment, yes. Areas that still have healthy levels of demand like water, no, you're not really seeing any cost reductions.
Okay, thanks. And last question, then I've got an observation. Is there a magic bullet that we can use to solve the reduction in GDP productivity in the Waikato region? Is there a single thing that we should be focused on? That's one of our lanes that we should be travelling down. Is there anything you can pass on to us which is going to help?
Not a silver bullet. I mean, there is a range of stuff, and again, sometimes it's in your purview, and sometimes it's more indirect support that you can provide. Parts of the productivity question are going to come down to central government settings around, broader infrastructure investment, around education provision and skills and what have you. Part of it's going to come down to private businesses actually going, well, I really need to, pull finger and take a few more risks, because otherwise I'll just sit in the position I am. I guess it's probably identifying some of the advantages that you have naturally. Like you look at some of the Gallaghers, the Holters and that of the world and going, why did they do so well? Where were they located? What did they, what made those differences? Part of that will come down to some of the enforcement and regulation that council provides. At the same time, it's got to provide enough regulation and enforcement that, there are rules for a reason and similar. But I think it's probably those areas where you do have a greater ability to set the right conditions, one, for businesses who are currently here and want to operate and want to be as streamlined as possible, but two, creating the environment so that businesses, when they cast their mind across the country and go, where do I want to base myself, that the Waikato was at least closer to the top of the list, if not the top. Because I think that's probably the challenge at the moment. For a lot of businesses, if you ask people, if you were to reinvent your business and put it somewhere today, people traditionally normally go to the urban centres, Auckland, Wellington and Christchurch, more because of the bulk of people. As I highlighted earlier, if you do see that continued population growth that puts sort of the Hamilton urban area and the wider Waikato as the third largest urban centre, that starts to change the game. But you've got to convince people that this is a good area to make sure they base themselves so that you're attracting them in.
Thanks, Stu.
Oh, thanks, Brad. You talked about food prices and the environment that's really impacting international food prices. Can you just sort of focus on
Flesh
a
it
little
out. Yep,
Yeah.
totally. Probably the easiest two are chocolate and coffee. We have seen big gains of those overseas. That was because in the Ivory Coast, you saw cocoa production that fell materially the last couple of years because it was too hot, I think. Pretty sure Ivory Coast was the drought. Then the likes of coffee, production out of Vietnam, Brazil and similar being affected, yields coming down quite a lot for coffee bean production because they had a number of floods and similar which washed out production. So part of that is that, same with, so the other one is of course olive oil prices quite a bit higher the last couple of years. That was being caused because olive production out of particularly Europe was last year its lowest in a decade. Now, all of those are different measures, but they're generally because of more extreme climatic conditions that are coming forward. Even though the likes of, take beef prices, for example, quite high at the moment, New Zealand's still doing all right. We're able to produce good stuff. But you're seeing, for example, in the US, the lowest numbers of US beef stock in about, I think, 50 years, maybe longer. And part of that as well is when they're trying to bring through more cattle, often they're having increasing sort of biological challenges. So a lot of screwworm coming over from Mexico and similar, which again is generally, the evidence suggests, a little bit more driven by more extreme climatic conditions, hotter, colder, whatever, wetter, whatever it might be. And so we are seeing in a number of those food cost areas, those bigger increases that are coming through because something's happened, because there's been, wilder weather, sort of similar to what we saw after Cyclone Gabrielle, where funnily enough, the cyclone wiped out a fair amount of New Zealand's kumara production, and we saw a more than doubling in prices for those products. So it's a very, very, I guess, I was going to say simple, but more logical step of weather hits, you get lower production, so supply is lower. Demand doesn't change because everyone still wants that stuff, and then prices go higher.
And one could imagine some of those climatic trends aren't likely to change in a hurry, are they?
It'll probably get worse, if anything, in a sense. What I guess is also interesting, though, and that's why I highlighted the potential, I think, around the likes of horticulture and fruit and similar locally, is that you're also, I think, having a bit more of a change in what can and will be grown in any one area. Now, I'm not saying that that's necessarily good for the Waikato, but circumstances have changed, and so you are starting to see people that are casting the net around. You're seeing, I think, a lot more of that across the country as well. Up in Kaipara a couple of years ago, they were figuring out if they could grow peanuts up in those areas. Again, just sort of provides a different mix of options. Given the Waikato's already quite strong on the likes of food and beverage production, I think, again, that's the sort of area where a little bit more of that is often where you can then create some of the higher value add options. Just as a final observation, though, on the trade front, and I think what that means for us in the future, New Zealand will have to collaborate a lot more with other entities overseas in terms of what our markets want, because we are seeing a greater level of almost patriotism, nationalism coming through from different areas where, China wants to be made in China for Chinese people. Having recently been on a trip there, New Zealand cheese slices, good old humble cheese slice. They've now created 3 varieties of those to sell into the local Chinese market with a tomato flavour, a green Szechuan pepper, and a spicy crayfish flavour, all because it was, New Zealand product, but sort of tailored for that market. So again, I think in terms of how we innovate into the future, we've got some great fundamentals, we've got some good production. It's then how we sort of move that up the value chain and look for other opportunities.
Excellent, thank you.
Ben.
Yes. So you talked about Auckland and Wellington being more depressed and the Waikato is doing better, largely because of agricultural exports. What can we do to boost that, and what impacts will mandated environmental controls such as PC1 have upon agricultural prosperity?
I guess over the longer term, you'd expect that those various changes coming through in our minds will dampen relative to what it otherwise would have been, sort of primary sector activities and investment. But equally, I guess that's the pessimistic but fairly straightforward view that often economists come to. I guess in my mind, I'd also see there to be a bit more focus on innovation in some of those areas. People going, well, look, we still want to produce, there's clearly money to be made, but we have to do it in a different way from before. So I do think that sort of in parts of those sort of more technological changes, you might see a bit more of that. For example, we know that actually for New Zealand, our biggest exports to the US in terms of proportion, some of the bigger ones are the likes of agricultural and other sort of machinery and other manufacturings like that. So it's not just pure food, if you will, but it's the tech that goes into it. So I think probably opportunity there alongside risk. In terms of how you stimulate a bit more confidence and activity, it is tricky because I think, you hear this from government as well. They go, well, in a sense, what do people want? If people are feeling worried about their futures and worried about trade and investment, unless you say to them, well, we're going to buy all of your product, which the government's clearly not going to do. And to be fair, I don't think the regional council is going to do either. It's hard in that sort of direct space to do that. I think part of it, though, is providing from a regional council point of view, a solid enough pipeline of continuing activities and a fairly confident view of where you're going. Businesses like it or lump it with rules, like a bit of stability. As a business, you don't have to like the rules that are put in place, but you have to know how to operate through them. If, like the US, you're changing the rules every couple of seconds, people go, well, whoa, I don't know what one to do. I don't know if I invest in this area to try and, mitigate the challenge that is coming forward, or if that rule is going to be rolled back in 3 seconds' time, in which case I just invested a whole bunch of money for nothing. So I think part of that is around the investment sort of strategy for the organisation going forward to make sure that there is a clear line of sight of what that looks like and what's being invested in long term. And then secondly, that when rules change, they are as well signalled and sort of as well formulaically laid through rather than sort of big chops and changes at any point. I don't think any of that's happening, to be fair, at the moment, that you're doing anything wrong, if you will, but as much as possible, those are areas where I think you can have a lot more direct influence.
Cool. On to cost of living and housing. One of the things that's suppressing people's confidence in spending is the fact that housing prices are falling. And at the same time, we've got rates rising. We've got 15.5% for Hamilton City. Talking to someone yesterday, their rates are going up by $360 at the same time as their house value has fallen by $100,000. So all of that's compounding. Any comments on that?
I think probably to divorce the 2 points a little bit, in terms of the rates rises clearly across the country are large. If you look at them back in time, it is almost that we are just playing a bit of catch up, though. And probably more importantly, that and I've made these comments before to this organisation and others, that we spend a lot of time talking about rates and very little time talking about tax. We've actually done some analysis that we will be bringing out in the next couple of months that suggests or shows quite clearly that the increase in the dollar amount that you're paying for rates as an average household has been a third of the increase in how much you're paying in tax in recent years. But again, I digress. On the first point, I'm actually quite stoked that the housing market is in the depressed state it's in while we are still getting a bit of economic recovery. I really do genuinely think we are starting to divorce New Zealand's economic trends with our housing market trends. It is tough, though. You're completely right, though, that New Zealanders do generally tie their wealth and their expectations around spending and how good they feel about things to what their house value is doing. And so those being in a depressed state do have an influence. It's even more, I think, marked in Auckland, where they came out with their revaluations a couple of months back. Everyone knew that house prices in Auckland had come back the last couple of years. You'd have to be living under a rock. But the amount of focus that the 9% fall in average valuations in the Auckland super city had was incredible. And it really did speak to exactly that point around confidence. I would also say, though, that you see an underlying tone of confidence ex the housing market when you look at the likes of business creation and similar. It's impossible, I think, to say that the economy is in that deep and dark of a place when clearly more people are making businesses on a net basis. So I think what you're seeing is less a general depressed view of things there, more of an ongoing recalibration or repivot away from the housing market being quite as much of a driver of consumer sentiment towards other things. But by goodness, it's a very difficult decoupling on that front. But I'm quite glad actually that it's happening.
The other point you raised.
And I'm going to stop you there and just move on to Jen. One last question from Jennifer. Thanks.
The economy doesn't. Sector do.
From here on out, you mean?
Yeah.
Probably still construction would be the area that we're probably most worried about, just because it's so interest rate sensitive at the moment that even with interest rates coming down a lot, construction hasn't moved a lot forward. You've got a lot more supply that's come onto the market, and you haven't got quite as much demand because population growth at a national level isn't growing at quite the same pace. So it's probably construction that's a lot more in focus for that sort of downturn. The other areas, I guess, would be the likes of retail, trade and similar, just because if you don't get people spending, if they're not feeling confident enough to do so, that'll limit the number of jobs coming through in retail.
Confidence for the finance sector, though.
Finance in general, probably all right. I mean, geez, if you look at the likes of equity markets and similar, you wouldn't know there's been anything wrong in the economy globally in recent times. Don't look as much at the New Zealand market because it's so much slimmer. But I think probably, expectations there are all right. And you look at a number of key New Zealand companies, and actually a lot of them are doing okay in the more innovative space. Those who are sort of much larger, you look at the reporting even yesterday from the likes of Fletcher Building, from Spark and what have you, big legacy challenges for a lot of them, haven't pivoted quite as quickly as other businesses in a tough spot. Those who are or have been a lot more nimble, actually generally in a better position.
We could spend a day on this.
Yes, I know. It's nice to have your own economist in the room, and we do have another one sitting beside him. So
we should just do a big lunch at some point, just smorgasbord around the table.
If we could
Exactly.
get the slides a little bit
Yes.
ahead of time,
Yep.
then we can think faster. Yeah, beforehand. Thank
No,
you.
no, really appreciate the input and one of your points that you raised just previously, I think it was to one of Ben's questions, but that stability for business and that sort of thing. Yep, the rules come and go, but it's that confidence and that
That's massive.
stability for them to invest in this region is super important. So thank you very, very much for your presentation once again. And thank you, Blair, for coming in and your report as well. And councillors, I welcome you to take any further questions to Blair as we move forward. But once again, gentlemen, thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, so we have that report to be received. Thank you, Mikael. Thank you, Robbie. All those in favour? Opposed? So carried. Next item up we have is our clean vessel plan. We had a little bit of a briefing on this recently, and so this is just an update on where that is at the moment.
Awesome. Look, thank you very much, councillors, for the opportunity to come back to you and I guess provide a little bit more detail on the clean vessel plan. You'll recall that Danielle and I gave you a very high level update at the last meeting. So we're really pleased to be able to come back to you with a lot more what the program's going to look like and where it's going. So I won't talk any further. I just want to introduce Danielle. She's our freshwater and marine lead, and Andrew Harrison, who will introduce himself in a second, who's been helping the top 4 councils progress this program. So that's me. So hand over. Thanks.
Thanks, Patrick.
Oh, kia ora tātou. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, good as gold. Yeah,
Cool.
just keep that mic nice and close. Thank you.
Right. So look, I'm Andrew Harrison. Giving the 4 councils involved in the Clean Vessel Plan a bit of a hand. Yes, my background's in biosecurity, biodiversity, have led the pest management and biosecurity animal welfare policy functions in government for a while. Last 13 years for my sins as a consultant, I've prepared most of the national pest and pathway management plans for government and various industries, Mycoplasma bovis being the last one. Very relevant here in the Waikato. So look, that's me, and absolute privilege to be supporting councils with this plan. So we've got some slides. I'm not sure who's operating those.
Rock at this end is, so
Yeah,
if not,
cool.
if you will say next slide, please, you'll be all over it.
Awesome. So if you're ready for that, I'll probably just run through. There's only 5 slides, so hopefully some more time for questions. The purpose of this item now is really to provide councillors with an update. So we'll take the paper as read and seek your endorsement of kind of the next steps, which I'll talk to. So for the last little while, sort of late last year, early this year, there's been some engagement with the Minister and MPI, some good feedback, some particular concerns raised around impacts on the commercial sector. We've done some further engagement, which is just wrapping up at the moment with industry. At this point, we're now seeking that feedback and endorsement that I talked about, and updating the proposal dealing with the that really good feedback that we've just received. The next steps then are later this year planning to submit the Clean Vessel Plan proposal through to the Minister. The actual details of that and some of the consultation documentation may not be ready at the time, but we'll be asking the Minister to initiate the Cabinet process. That takes a couple of months. We'll then have an opportunity to finalise everything, bring the full pack of information through back to Council so that you'll have a chance to look at it. We'll be seeking your endorsement then, and then it will go forward to Cabinet. Be asking Cabinet to approve then a full consultation process with public, industry, treaty partners, etc. So that's the course, and then it goes through a statutory course that I'll happy to answer questions, but I won't bore you with if you don't want to know about that. Right, next slide. So the Clean Vessel Plan is a pathway management approach. I understand councillors have a pretty good understanding of that through your various experience with curricular and other biosecurity issues. So the pathway in this case is marine vessels, domestic vessels we're dealing with here, and really focusing on the risk associated with the vessel hull through biofouling, but also topside risk. So if you think of something like Callirpa, spread through your anchor, warp chain, agricultural fishing equipment, etc. So that equipment that is used on vessels that is then used in water is also covered. And then we're thinking about the role of high-risk structures in terms of the impact they have on biofouling. So that's the scope of this. And as I said, it's a national pathway management plan proposal under the Biosecurity Act. So you have your regional plans, which I'm sure you're very familiar with. This is just the national equivalent. Next slide. So focusing on the 4 northern regions, and I think you're familiar with that. The previous slide just mentioned that there were 70% of the vessels in New Zealand covered within the scope of those regions. What we're essentially trying to do here is shift from I guess a region by region approach where there are some differences in requirements at the moment. Some have regulation, some don't. You are one that don't. And then there are differences in the biofouling standard. There's differences in whether that applies only when vessels are moving versus at all times. And then some differences in what other things that the plan applies to, like aquaculture equipment, structures, etc. So looking to harmonise those, have one consistent set of rules, starting with the 4 northern regions and the management area that you see on that slide out to the 12 nautical mile limit, and have essentially four rules in place. So one that's covering a biofouling standard of slime layer and barnacles only, an equivalence option that's then available to the commercial sector and large vessels who have challenges around access to infrastructure. A second rule that's focusing on gear and equipment, so which I talked about earlier, making sure that that's free of any visible fouling or sediment. A third one, which is a rule around kind of what I call a rule of last resort. So an ability to work with high-risk structure owners, so that would be ports, marinas, cleaning facilities, aquaculture farms, marine farms, to work with structure owners to put in place basic biosecurity measures if they weren't doing so already. Most of those structure owners are actually doing a really good job, so there's not a big problem to fix there. So that's an enabling rule of last resort. And then a fourth rule, which is more administrative around making it clear that the agencies can access certain types of information that they need around to understand risk and to understand if the plan's been complied with. So starting with the first four regions, with an intent then to expand this across the country over time, and yeah, sort of a strong strategic intent from wider councils and from central government around that. The regions that have existing rules in their plans under the biosecurity legislation would be rescinded when this plan comes into effect. So we're essentially trying to streamline and harmonise things. And for some of those regions, this will lead to, I suggest, a lot more feasible, achievable requirements, particularly for the commercial sector. Next slide. So I guess implications for council briefly, and I'm sure you'll want to discuss some of these. So there'll be new rules that apply for the first time in this region, obviously then consistent with the other regions. A coordinated program of engagement, education and compliance efforts. So there is some of that, but this would bring in place a national management agency, which I'll talk about. And I guess the positive changes in behaviour and greater protection as you start to scale this up and drive greater coordination. There's no proposed change to Waikato Regional Councils or any of the other councils' budget, so not looking for additional investment. There is a proposal to introduce a new national levy, so $200 per annum charged on moorings or berths. And then there'd be a national management agency that levy would be payable through to. There's a couple of options around that, which I won't go into in detail, but happy to answer any questions on. So coordinated council led option, and then a Biosecurity New Zealand led option. So they're both still on the table at the moment with at this stage an indicative plan to consult on both. And I guess an important point for council would be that there'll be a significant ability to exercise control over that management agency through governance representation, which is really important, but probably more so through a funding agreement where you'd start to set some of the key principles around how funding will flow and clarity around roles and responsibilities, etc. And this council and others would continue to play a key role in operational delivery. So the same sort of roles that you're playing at the moment around surveillance, monitoring, etc. Final slide. So I guess this is a point that industry have particularly emphasised, which is the importance of holistic and effective implementation. And they actually use those words. What we're looking at here is harmonising not just harmonising the rules across regions, but also harmonising this with the requirements that international vessels have to meet so that we don't have duplication of domestic and international regimes. Happy to explain that further. I think I've touched on that more coordinated and consistent approach driven through a management agency around education, compliance, etc. Councils have worked together with government to develop a thing called the Marine Vessel Portal. Already has 21,000 vessels in it. It's a tool, if you like, to access information on vessels. Really good tool. As I've gone out and spoken to industry, they're really interested in how that might be, how they might be able to access that. So I think that's a real value add that's coming through this. The other thing that industry's asked for and others is just wanting to make sure they have really good tools available so that meeting these requirements is feasible and achievable, which is absolutely fair enough. Wanting more guidance and standards around things like cleaning, etc. So and access to better tools. So looking for better anti-fouling paints, for example, and support from government to help with that. I think this region finally, in terms of access to haul-out facilities and provisions around in-water cleaning, you're in reasonably good shape at the moment. But those are quite strategic issues for the country where we need to keep ahead of that and make sure there's that sort of access to enable this to be implemented effectively. So I'll stop there and through the chair, happy to take any questions.
Thanks for that. A couple of quick ones from me. Just you've landed on a 20-metre plus vessel size for this. Reasoning behind that?
So that was for recreational vessels. 20-metre plus was really around ability to access infrastructure, haul-out facilities. So 20+ metre vessels, I understand there's less options, so they'll tend to have much greater lead-in times before they can access those facilities, or they have to travel further. So if you think about that, more downtime.
Yep. So
it becomes a lot more important to have a kind of a proactive approach where they can plan ahead with confidence, months, in some cases years in advance for the really large vessels. But that's where that's come from.
Yeah, I just note that, around me, I'm in Tairua, but there's a number of vessels under that size that are on pole moorings, on swing moorings and marinas sort of thing. So I just wonder if there's a percentage there being missed, but obviously this will be a moving plan as such. Any idea what the Waikato vessel fleet size is?
I'll let Danielle talk to that.
Yeah. Yep.
It's about 1,200 vessels, but likely to grow. There's some significant growth in some of the marinas. So.
Yeah. And lastly, international fleet are completely outside this plan. This is just
So that, yes, completely outside this plan. There are vessels that will have to satisfy international and domestic requirements. So that equivalence option is modelled on the international requirements under the IMO and MPI. So it'll help them.
leave your light on, otherwise you'll lose it. Thank you. Chris. Okay, Ben.
I'm just interested in the $200 per vessel. So basically the intent is to collect them from the marine structure owners. So if you're in a marina, the marina would collect the funds. Is that right?
That's correct. It's correct for both moorings and berths. There's a few more nuances to go through around that, sort of working with the ports, etc., which we're still working through, but correct.
Right. I imagine you'll get pushback from a lot of these vessel owners that they don't want to pay an extra $200 on top of their already expensive marina berths. So I guess that's something to move through. Yep. Will it be a national levy applied nationally, or will it only be applied to the Upper North Island to begin with?
So it'll be a national levy only applied to the Upper North Island.
Will that get people moving their boats away from this area?
So I'm not sure I can answer that. The dynamics around moving vessels. Would you move a vessel to another region just because there's a $200 fee? I imagine. I imagine not, but there hasn't been any specific research around that I'm aware of.
Fine. And in terms of Te Uru Kahika, it's not really set up as a body to be collecting funds or anything off anyone. So I'm surprised they're mentioned there as an option. It seemed to me Biosecurity New Zealand would be the logical people to have a national rollout of a system.
Yeah, so Te Uru Kahika, it does have RSHL holdings, but it could potentially set up for example, another CCO. This is all still being worked through with them, but it could be another entity set up under the auspices of Te Uru Kahika rather than Te Uru Kahika itself. But that option's still being worked through. We're going to pull together a business case for that and put that through the regional CEs group and bring that back to you before it goes out. But I think what you're getting at is it's not a legal entity as such itself, but there could be a legal entity set up like a CCO under it. So we're still yet to traverse through all the detail around that.
It's interesting to see this as a new way of raising $3 million, but what happens if the levy doesn't go ahead? what will the impact be on this program if you don't get the levy? Well, I mean, presumably, but you presumably are requiring cleaning of vessels at the moment?
Not under law in the Waikato. In the other regions, it would continue under their regional pestle pathway management plans. And one of them, for example, Northland already collects, I think it's an $80 fee at the moment. So that would all continue. But yeah, if the levy doesn't go through, so the levy proposal is it sits within the National Pathway Management Plan proposal. And if that didn't go ahead, there wouldn't be a funding mechanism, therefore that plan would not go ahead.
But presumably we could bring in a levy option here if you didn't have the national option, like Northland.
I think that's some of the detail to work through, Ben.
Yeah.
There's a lot of it can buy Security New Zealand afford any funding and input into this. If you look at those facts and figures, there's a lot of money to be raised apart from the potential $3 million from the $200 per vessel. So it's the devil in the detail, which isn't worked out yet.
Cool.
Stu.
Oh, no, thank you. Hey, look, really supportive of this and acknowledge all the work that's been put into date. I guess my main question is, look, I think $200 is a drop in the ocean compared to owning some of these boats, but I don't think it's going to be an issue. But are you confident in your figures? Because it seems to me that $200 isn't enough. And in note of your other comments that we're not looking for any extra income to get this process underway.
Yeah, the $200 was reached by modelling the costs of running this program and then looking at the shortfall after looking at current council and central government investment. So that's where the figures come from, and then it models out at around $200 per annum. So I think there's a reasonably high level of confidence that figure's about right.
That's good. Yep. Yeah. Okay then. Look, I'd also just echo the same concerns that Warren did about that. Was it 20 metres? I think, yeah, because and look, I'm not over the detail completely, but just need, to my mind, all vessels that are either in a marina or that aren't trailer boats, I think need to be part of this in the long term.
Yeah. So I'll just clarify that. So the 20-metre vessels is all vessels that are sitting in the ocean on a marina or a berth or something around, all of those will have to comply with that rule. They'll all have to meet the biofouling standard, with an exception being for commercial vessels or vessels over 20 metres. There would be an alternate option, equivalence option, where they could comply through that.
Yeah.
And then for the second rule, which is around the topside risk, gear and equipment on vessels, that will apply to any vessel. So it will also apply to I'm a keen fisherman, so it'll apply to my vessel as well.
Okay, now that's good to clarify that. And I mean, just as an additional comment, I still think we're long overdue for boat registration in this country as well, but it's something for the future. I acknowledge we need to get this off the ground first. But
Noted.
I don't know whether I'd campaign on that, Stu.
He doesn't have a boat yet.
Yeah. Kia ora.
Morena. My questions are kind of weird. They're not about the pests in themselves. So first and foremost, the marine pests are obviously bad for the land, right? Because they're already in the sea. They're spread around the sea, and I haven't seen anything where we are trying to get rid of these pests in the sea. So I'm presuming that the clean vessel paper is about ensuring they don't get on land. Am I right or wrong?
No, it's not about ensuring they don't get on land. So we have a number of marine invasive species that you will know about. They're already here. This is about partly it's about trying to slow or prevent their spread through this vessel pathway. So if you think about Karakia arriving in New Zealand, if we'd had this in place and kind of a supercharged program, which is what I'd describe this as, it would be helping to prevent or slow the spread of this thing. But there's also a lot of marine pests around the world that we don't have. And and some of them could actually be here and we don't know yet. So there's always a lag between when something arrives and establishes and when it's found. So this pathway management approach it's more a preventative approach. So, if they have arrived and we haven't even detected them yet, well, at least we've got good measures around the things that could spread them around the country, so that we have a better shot at reducing the impacts, impacts on agriculture, impacts on the environment, etc. And it is really difficult to eradicate. New Zealand's had a crack at a few, but it will always be challenging in this environment.
You're right.
Kia ora.
Okay, so I guess some of these pests that connect themselves to the vessels is determined on how long the vessel is in the water, or not. Because when you look at all of the big ships that come into New Zealand, whether they container ones or the ones that people go on tours on, they're out of sea for a long time. They were in port for a short time. Do we have any problems with that short-term life within our ports and these pests management?
So,
Or we're not looking at them, we're just looking at our Kiwi boats?
So we're just looking at our Kiwi boats, our New Zealand flagged vessels, but it's partly about how long vessels are in the water, but it's actually about some other things as well, like how often they move, how fast they move, because this will slough off, if they're moving regularly and at higher speeds. It's about the anti-foul coatings that are applied and how effective those are. It's about the marine growth prevention systems in larger vessels. So it's a combination of factors.
Okay, never mind, I can go on for you.
Kia ora.
But thanks for that.
There is regulations around international vessels and their movement. Just recently, there was a cruise ship refused entry into the Bay of Islands because of fouling and that sort of thing that was picked up in the port it came from in Australia. So there is some protection around that, but generally it's that international vessel movement that's going to bring those pests in that we don't have already. Real concern, and this is to look at stopping spreading them around our bit of the coastline up and down. Any other questions for the team?
Yep. What actually is done to actually clean the hull? There's $5 million set down here for managing an agency, surveillance, etc., etc. There's nothing about the actual cleaning process. Is that paid in addition to the $200?
So the cleaning of vessels would be the responsibility of the vessel's owners. So it's not covered in the costs of the plan per se. This is the regulatory regime, if you like, that sets the requirements. And then vessel owners have the ability to then decide how they're going to meet the requirements, because all vessels are different, right?
And in terms of, you talked about yourself as a small vehicle recreational fisherman, you would also be part of this as well.
So I would for that rule around gear equipment. I wouldn't be captured by the biofouling rule because I haul my boat out on a trailer. So all the trailer vessels, biofouling's not an issue.
Okay.
Whereas if I plonk my anchor down and then I pull it up and it's got a bit of caloper on it, well, I'm a risk of spreading it. So that rule captures all vessels.
Right. So as a trailer vessel, do you pay the $200?
No.
No. Thank you.
Right, thank you, councillors. We have a motion in front of us to accept the report and also endorse a proposal to progress this National Pathway Management Plan. And you heard that it will come back to us with more detail further down the track. So you're happy to move, Karawana? Is that one? Yep. Happy to second Councillor Downer. Thank you very much. All those in favour? Opposed? So carried. Thank you very much for that report, team.
Thank you very much,
Councillors, are
councillors.
we happy to carry on to the next item, or are we looking for a 10-minute break? A 5-minute break. Thank you, councillor. Right, 5-minute break back at, I'll give you 7. How's that? Back at 5 past.